this guy who didn't die by getting shot. He died because he had too much pot. That is, too much beer, remember? It's not that funny cigarette stuff. And so, but he forgot all that. Now let's pick up with Bill. He's come back from Europe, and he's ready to go out and kill the world. Right at the top of page 2, I took a night law course and obtained employment as investigator for a surety company. By the way, this is what I did. I came out of the Korean War and as a Marine, and I discharged out, and I immediately went to law school because I figured that's the place to make a lot of money. And also, I found out that I couldn't do beans with numbers and science, but I could sure talk. You know what they call a lawyer a mouthpiece, right? For good reason. So I figured that was the best place for me. Going on, the drive for success was on. I'd proved to the world I was important. My work took me about Wall Street, and little by little I became interested in the market. Many people lost money, but some became very rich. Aha, why not I? I could be one of those rich ones. I could have that house down on the bay. I could have that 50-foot Matthews. I could have that trophy blonde. We get rid of that Lois girl. Send her back to Macy's. Why not I? I studied economics and business as well as law. Potential alcoholic that I was, I nearly failed my law course. At one of the finals, I was too drunk to think or write. Sound potential to me. I think he was going a little easy on himself here. Isn't this part of the definition that we've come to understand? Here, he's got a final in law school. If he doesn't pass this final, he flunks the course, he doesn't get to be a lawyer. So he goes out and gets roaring drunk the night before, and is so drunk when he comes in he can't even see the test paper. It doesn't sound like just a kind of a hard drinker to me. Maybe I don't want to pass judgment on old Bill, but I think he was stretching a little bit here. Though my drinking was not yet continuous, it disturbed my wife. We had long talks. You can just see that, can't you? Sit down now. Sit down now, Lois. We're going to talk about this. It's okay, you know. Let's see what he said. When I would still her forebodings by telling her that men of genius conceived their best projects when drunk. The most majestic constructions of philosophic thought were so derived. And remember that Papa Hemingway was in his heyday right then. He was drinking up half of Key Weird down there, so everybody figured if you want to write about the old man, the sea, get roaring drunk. Anyway, I don't know, maybe he was over in Spain about that time. I guess he was. Writing For Whom the Bell Tolls. That's a pretty interesting book, you know, but I didn't like the ending. I hate sad endings. I don't like people I've come to like, you know, good character. I hate to see them get killed. Anyway, I don't know how you guys are, but I like books and movies with happy endings. I like the good guys to win. I want to be able to cry a little bit because it was such a good ending. Okay, here we find Bill now. He completed his law course. By the time I completed the course, I knew the law was not for me. Well, you see, at that time, the average salary of lawyers, average income of lawyers was probably around $5,000 a year. When I started practicing law, the average income of lawyers was about $8,600 a year, and there are guys out there now who make that much in a day. I remember when I upped my hourly fees from $20 to $25 an hour, and all my clients screamed bloody murder. You can't even get half of a paralegal for $25 an hour now. Anyway, I got into law too soon. I should have waited. I would have gotten some $300 an hour stuff. Anyway, here we find Bill. The inviting maelstrom of Wall Street had me in a script. Business and financial leaders were my heroes. Out of this alloy of drink and speculation, I commenced to forge the weapon that would one day turn in its flight like a boomerang and all but cut me to ribbons. Now, what he's talking about here is that he got to a point on Wall Street, as we're going to read here, where he was making a ton of money. And he put this all together, and we're just seeing the beginnings of it here. And part of Bill's biggest problem was that he was feeding his ego, feeding his pride. And as we all know, our problems are of our own making, that they arise out of ourselves, and that we are extreme examples of self-will run riot. And when Bill wrote that, he was speaking certainly of himself. Living modestly, my wife and I saved $1,000. It went into certain securities, then cheap and rather unpopular. I rightly imagined that they would someday have a great rise. I failed to persuade my broker friends to send me out looking over factories and managements, but my wife and I decided to go anyway. This Bill was one sharp cookie. I'm telling you, he was a smart guy. He figured out that if you could gather first-hand knowledge about these businesses that were being traded on the stock exchange, that you'd have a major leg up on other investors. And first-hand knowledge would come from actually being there. And so he tried to get the people on the street to finance him to go out and investigate some of these companies for him, but they wouldn't let him do it. Of course, at that time it was a feeding frenzy. You know, they were buying up every stock that came out because everybody was making a fortune. He says, I had developed the theory that most people lost money in stocks through ignorance of markets. I discovered many more reasons later on. Now, here we find Bill, and he's sat Lois down again. I can just imagine this, and had another one of these talks, and he convinced her that they had to go out and they had to investigate these companies. Well, they didn't have an automobile. We gave up our positions and off we roared on a motorcycle. The sidecar stuffed with tent, blankets, a change of clothes, and 3 huge volumes of financial reference service. And my vision is Lois riding on top of all this stuff, you know. I don't know. Oh man, our friends thought a lunacy commission should be appointed. Now, most of you never heard of a lunacy commission, but that's exactly what had happened to Ebby, you know. Just before he got sober, he was brought before a lunacy commission, which was there to determine whether or not he was crazy. And if the lunacy commission decided you were crazy, they stuck you away somewhere. And so those, I think they've pretty much done away with those now. But how would you have liked to have been the commissioner of lunacy? Oh man, sometimes I think, you know, we sometimes I think when we get to be a trusted servant around here, we could be called commissioner of lunacy, you know. It's like being a playground monitor sometimes, checking out the sandbox. Our friends thought a lunacy commission should be appointed. Perhaps they were right. I had had some success at speculation, so we had a little money, but we once worked on a farm for a month to avoid drawing on our small capital. That was the last honest manual labor on my part for many a day. We covered the whole eastern United States in a year. Now, Bill talks about this in other literature. What he was doing, they'd pull into a town where there was a factory or factories, and Bill would go talk to management if they'd talk to him, but he got most of his information going down to the local pub and buying drinks for the people who worked there. And after they'd had a couple drinks, they'd start spilling the beans to him. So he was getting all the inside information about these companies, and a whole bunch of it came to him because he was very good listener at the bar. And as he traveled from place to place, he put together a dossier on each of these companies. And he sent in reports to his friends in Wall Street on each of these companies. He says, at the end of it, my reports to Wall Street procured me a position there and the use of large expense account, because his insider information had made fortunes for people. They began to trust what he was writing and the reports he was saying, and they started to follow him. And Bill made a tremendous name for himself very fast by doing this. And so he was hired when he got back. They put him on a big expense account, and he loved that. And of course, big expense accounts are just exactly what every alcoholic needs. The exercise of an option brought in more money, leaving us with a profit of several $1,000s for that year. For the next few years, fortune threw money and applause my way. I had arrived. My judgment and ideas were followed by many to the tune of paper millions. The great boom of the late 20s was seething and swelling. Drink was taking an important and exhilarating part of my life. There was loud talk in the jazz places uptown. Everyone spent in thousands and chattered in millions. Scoffers could scoff and be damned. I made a host of fair weather friends. Did any of you ever go back to the places where you thought you had all those friends and find out that they hadn't missed you at all? Oh, were you gone? Oh. You're not drinking? Well, please excuse us. We have finish our conversation here. All of our friends. I worried about my friends for about 2 or 3 weeks before I found out exactly what they were. Going on, my drinking assumed more serious proportions, continuing all day and almost every night. The remonstrances of my friends terminated in a row, and I became a lone wolf. There were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. There had been no real infidelity. Oh, I love that word, real infidelity. What in the world do you suppose that means? Bill, you could have said there had been no infidelity. Leave out the word real. I don't know. I'm picking at nits here, but Bill is a wordsmith, you know, and so when you read what he writes, it's important to read every word, because each word has some meaning. And Bill was not willing to say that he did not cheat on his wife. He said there was no real infidelity, which leaves it up to my imagination. For loyalty to my wife, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of those scrapes. So you see, he's not denying that he had the inclination, he's denying he had the ability. And that was because he was staying drunk all the time. Now there's a lot of rumors that go around, still going around. You hear people saying all the time that Bill was out there doing all kinds of nasty stuff on his wife, but it never, as far as I know, there's never been any proof of it. And that kind of stuff gets credence around the fellowship, you know. People love to gossip and tell stories that they have no basis in fact for telling. So we can assume that Bill did a pretty good job of following the principles that he laid down for us to follow. In 1929, I contracted Gulf fever. We went at once to the country, my wife to applaud, while I started out to overtake Walter Hagen. Walter Hagen was the Tiger Woods of the day, or the Jack Nicklaus, or he was just before Sammy Snead. And Walter Hagen had won over in England at the big tournament over there. So now Bill was going to overtake him and become a better golfer than Walter Hagen. Liquor caught up with me much faster than I came up behind Walter. I began to be jittery in the morning. Golf permitted drinking every day and every night. It was fun to carry him around the exclusive course which had inspired such awe in me as a lad. I had acquired the impeccable coat of tan one sees upon the well-to-do. The local banker watched me whirl fat checks in and out of his till with amused skepticism. That's a great line. The local banker watching Bill in his ego and his pride, whirling checks in and out. But the banker was skeptical, because he'd probably seen some ups and downs in his life which Bill had never experienced. It was about to happen. Abruptly, in 1929, hell broke loose on the New York Stock Exchange. After one of those days of inferno, I wobbled from a hotel bar to a brokerage office. It was 8 o'clock, 5 hours after the market closed. The ticker still clattered. I was staring at an inch of tape which bore the inscription XYZ 32. It had been 52 that morning. I was finished, and so were many friends. The papers reported men jumping to death from the towers of high finance. That disgusted me. I would not jump. I went back to the bar. My friends had dropped several million since 10 o'clock. So what? Tomorrow is another day. As I drank, the old fierce determination to win came back. Now this is a description, of course, of the stock market crash, which preceded the Great Depression, which really lasted all the way through the 30s until the Second World War got started. We were beginning to come out of it around 1940. Next morning I telephoned a friend in Montreal. He had plenty of money left and thought I'd better go to Canada. By the following spring we were living in our accustomed style. I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba. Remember that now? Napoleon was exiled twice. The first time was to the island of Elba. And then he came back in triumph, and he reestablished his position. And then finally they got to him again, and the next time he was exiled to St. Helena. But when he came back from Elba, it was like a triumphal procession, everybody cheering him in the streets. But the next time they got rid of him, they got rid of him for good. So Bill's talking about he feel like Napoleon returning from Elba. He had been in exile in Canada, but drinking caught up with me again, and my generous friend had to let me go. This time we stayed broke. We went to live with my wife's parents. I found a job, then lost it as a result of a brawl with a taxi driver. Why in the world? Why would he get fired for? He wasn't driving a taxi, I don't think. Oh well. Mercifully, no one could guess that I was to have no real employment for 5 years, or hardly draw a sober breath. My wife, my poor wife, began to work in a department store, coming home exhausted to find me drunk. I became an unwelcome hanger-on at brokerage places. Now this is where the cheese, as they say, begins to get binding, because Bill has crossed over the line now. Now we're going to hear about the devastation that alcohol causes to a real alcoholic. And we're not talking about people who just drink a little too much and get a DUI or something. We're talking about people with the disease of alcoholism, a progressive, incurable, and deadly disease. And now we find Bill really caught in it. Liquor ceased to be a luxury. It became a necessity. Bathtub gin, 2 bottles a day, and often 3, got to be routine. I don't know if any of you ever even smelled bathtub gin, let alone drank it. I imagine there are a couple of people here who probably saw it around the house, but this was raw. It was basically alcohol, and it would just tear your guts out. And Bill was drinking 2-3 bottles of that a day. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s, and I would pay my bills at the bars and delicatessens. We don't want to get cut off down at the bar. This went on endlessly, and I began to awaken very early in the morning, shaking violently. A tumbler full of gin, followed by a half-dozen bottles of beer, would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. Nevertheless, I still thought I could control the situation. And there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. So what we're hearing here is we're seeing Bill, even though he is being destroyed by alcohol, in full-blown denial that he has a problem. And he was proving that he had no problem by stopping drinking from time to time. See, I don't have to drink. See, I can get sober. This probably sounds familiar to a lot of you here. Gradually, things got worse. The house was taken over by the mortgage holder. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. Then I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at the low point of 1932, and I had somehow formed a group to buy. I was to share generously in the profits. Well, you know what happened. Then I went on a prodigious bender, and the chance vanished. Remember when we were reading the doctor's opinion, he talked about exactly the same thing with one of his patients. A promising business opportunity, and a couple days before it was to all get started, he went out and got drunk and lost the whole thing. And this is so insane. And people who are not like us, people who don't have our disease, can never understand it. But you guys understand it because you've been there. I mean, this insanity is a part of what's wrong with us. And we can't fight with it ourselves. We don't have any power over our insanity. We have to have God's help. The second step tells us, doesn't it, that He could restore us to sanity. And by the time we get to the 10th step, we have been restored to sanity. Miracle. I woke up. This had to be stopped. I saw I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever. Before then I had written lots of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business, and so I did. Shortly afterward I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way, and I had taken it. Was I crazy? I began to wonder, for such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that. Renewing my resolve, I tried again. Some time passed, and confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness. I could laugh at the gin mills. Ha 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 ha. Now I had what it takes. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone. In no time I was beating on the bar, asking myself how it happened. As the whiskey rose to my head, I told myself I would manage better next time, but I might as well get good and drunk then. And I did. The remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. The courage to do battle was not there. My brain raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. I hardly dared cross the street, lest I collapse and be run down by an early morning truck, for it was scarcely daylight. An all-night place supplied me with a dozen glasses of ale. My writhing nerves were stilled at last. A morning paper told me the market had gone to hell again, and so had I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. That was a hard thought. Should I kill myself? No, not now. Then a mental fog settled down. Gin would fix that. So 2 bottles and oblivion. The mind and body are marvelous mechanisms. For mine endured this agony for 2 more years. Sometimes I stole from my wife's slender purse That doesn't mean a thin purse. It means there wasn't much money in it. From my wife's slender purse, when the morning terror and madness were on me. Again I swayed dizzily before an open window or the medicine cabinet where there was poison, cursing myself for a weakling. There were flights from city to country and back as my wife and I sought escape. Then came the night when the physical and mental torture was so hellish I feared I would burst through my window sash and all. Somehow I managed to drag my mattress to a lower floor lest I suddenly leap. A doctor came with a heavy sedative. Next day found me drinking both gin and sedative. This combination soon landed me on the rocks. People feared for my sanity, so did I. I could eat little or nothing when drinking, and I was 40 pounds underweight. Dr. Silkworth talked about this, and remember in his opinion, that some people don't stop and they are willing to accept death rather than having to face the terrors of stopping drinking. My brother-in-law is a physician, and through his kindness and that of my mother, I was placed in a nationally known hospital for the mental and physical rehabilitation of alcoholics. All right, this is the first time now that we hear about Towns Hospital. Bill doesn't identify it here, but the doctor's opinion and Dr. Silkworth have already identified Towns Hospital for us. We know all about it. We know that this was in New York City. We know that Dr. Silkworth was the director of the hospital, the medical director, that they had been in business for a long, long time, and that they were one of the leading hospitals in the world for the treatment of alcoholism and drug addiction. And yet we also learned from Dr. Silkworth that there were many cases that came through their doors that they couldn't help at all. They could get them detoxed all right, but they had no effect whatsoever in stopping them from drinking or using. Going on page 7 now. Under the so-called belladonna treatment, my brain cleared. You know what belladonna is? It's a poison. They were poisoning these people. I think in some places called nightshade. You get a little bit too much of that stuff, it'll kill you. Okay, so now Bill has been belladonna'd and cleared up his brain. Hydrotherapy, which of course is, you can visualize it. Hydrotherapy, it's either a hot bath or a cold bath, or they stick you in a room with pressure hoses and spray you. I'm not sure what he's talking about here, but it's the same stuff they use on all mentally ill people. Hydrotherapy and mild exercise help much. Best of all, I met a kind doctor, Dr. Silkworth, who explained that though certainly selfish and foolish, talking about Bill being selfish and foolish, I had been seriously ill, bodily and mentally. It relieved me somewhat to learn that in alcoholics the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor, though it often remains strong in other respects. My incredible behavior in the face of a desperate desire to stop was explained. Aha, big sigh of relief, right? You see, all of this, the stuff I was doing, the decisions based on self that I was making, all of my crapped out behavior, now I can explain it. It's because I'm sick. Big sigh of relief means I don't have to accept any responsibility for it. And this is what Bill was feeling. Understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hope. For 3 or 4 months the goose hung high. That's an old expression that means that everything was fine. In the old English pubs or in the restaurants or taverns, the goose, they served goose all the time, and the goose was up here and it was hanging from a rafter. And so when the geese were there and the goose was there and you knew you were going to be able to eat good, the goose hung high. I went to town regularly and even made a little money. Surely this was the answer Self-knowledge. No, Bill. We just got through reading what Fred said about that, right? That self-knowledge and fear of the consequences didn't keep him sober. But it was not. Self-knowledge was not the answer. For the frightful day came when I drank once more. The curve of my declining moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump. At the time I returned to the hospital, this was the finish, the curtain, it seemed to me. My weary and despairing wife was informed that it would all end with heart failure during delirium tremens, or I would develop a wet brain, perhaps within a year. She would soon have to give me over to the undertaker or the asylum. They did not need to tell me. I knew and almost welcomed the idea. See, Bill had actually was working his first step here, wasn't he? I mean, he was getting, he knew, and he knew that he could not drink successfully. So we needed to see where his first step kicked in for Bill, because a little bit later we're going to be looking at his second step. Then we're going to be looking at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 11 while he was still in the hospital, and then 12. Okay, it was a devastating blow to my pride. I, who had thought so well of myself and my abilities, of my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last. Now I was to plunge into the dark, joining that endless procession of sots who had gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What would I not give to make amends? But that was over now. No words could tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. Please hear what that's saying. Fear sobered me for a bit. And that's the one place where we can probably see that for some of us, fear is a salutary effect. If it is enough to get us started and to get us in here. But we cannot count on fear to keep us sober. Fear sobered me for a bit, Bill says. Then came the insidious insanity of that first drink, and on Armistice Day 1934, which by the way was November 11th, we now call it Veterans Day, but it was Armistice Day, the day the armistice was signed between the Germans and the Allies in World War I. I was off again. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere or would stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness as a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. And we're going to cut off right then, because I'll tell you when we come back next week, we're going to begin Bill's recovery. And we're going to begin to read what happened when his friend Ebby came to visit him. And this is a wonderful chapter in the fellowship, and so many of the slender threads upon which our sobriety now hangs all started back then. And when we read this, we're going to see how each one of the things that happened had to happen as it did in order for you and me to be here, and for me at least to still be alive, because I would have been long gone.